Between 1945 and 1950, Europe was completely destroyed. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Industrial infrastructure had disappeared. Millions of people wandered without homes, without food, without a future. And then, in less than a decade, a miracle emerged: bridges, roads, factories, hospitals. Europe rose from the ashes, but there was one detail that no one wanted to discuss openly. Where did the money come from? The official answer was always simple: the Marshall Plan. The United States injected billions of dollars to rebuild the continent, but that's only half the story. The other half is buried in Swiss vaults, in central bank basements, in gold bars stamped with the Nazi eagle, gold stolen from Jews, from invaded nations, from looted central banks. Gold that theoretically should have been returned, but it wasn't. That gold didn't disappear. It was recycled, laundered, legitimized, and used to finance the reconstruction of the same Europe that Hitler tried to dominate. The question isn't whether this happened. The question is, why doesn't anyone talk about it? Here, where history, power, and economics meet, we reveal the truths that shape civilizations. It's estimated that the Third Reich stole between 600 and 900 tons of gold during World War II. That value, adjusted for today, would equal more than $50 billion. Gold from the central banks of Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Gold confiscated from Jews murdered in concentration camps. Gold ripped from teeth, watches, wedding rings. But here's the paradox: when the war ended, only a fraction of that gold was recovered and returned. Most of it simply disappeared from official records. And in the following years, as Europe rebuilt itself, gold bars with unclear origins began circulating freely through international financial markets. Coincidence? No, the truth is that Europe's reconstruction wasn't financed solely by American generosity. It was also financed by the greatest theft in modern history. And the main facilitators of this process weren't war criminals. They were banks. Swiss banks, British banks, American banks. Respectable institutions that, in the name of global financial stability, decided to look the other way. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to 1938. When Hitler annexed Austria, the Reichsbank, the Nazi central bank, immediately confiscated Austrian gold reserves, 91 tons. When he invaded Czechoslovakia in 1939, another 23 tons were stolen. In 1940, after conquering Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, the Nazi gold stockpile grew exponentially. But the true horror began with Operation Reinhard, the plan to exterminate European Jews. Everything that was confiscated, jewelry, coins, valuables, was sent to the Reichsbank. There, the gold was melted down, transformed into standardized bars, and restamped with official German symbols. The objective was to erase any trace of origin. This gold had a strategic function: to buy war materials from neutral countries. Switzerland, Portugal, Spain, Turkey, and Sweden continued trading with Nazi Germany throughout the entire war. And they accepted gold as payment. Did they know that gold was stolen? Of course they knew, but they pretended not to know. The Swiss National Bank was the main facilitator. Between 1939 and 1945, it received approximately 440 tons of gold from the Reichsbank. Officially, it was a legitimate commercial transaction between central banks. In practice, it was money laundering on an industrial scale. The process was simple: Nazi gold arrived in Switzerland. The Swiss National Bank issued Swiss francs in exchange. With those francs, Germany bought strategic materials: tungsten from Portugal, bearings from Sweden, financial credits from private banks. The gold was then resold to other countries or simply remained in Swiss vaults without clear identification of origin. But Switzerland wasn't alone. British banks also participated. The Bank of England, even before the war ended, began receiving gold of dubious origin through neutral intermediaries. Bars were melted down, restamped, purified. Within months, Nazi gold became international gold. And here's the crucial point: no one wanted to investigate deeply. Because if they did, the global financial system would collapse. Imagine discovering that half of European central banks' gold reserves had criminal origins. Imagine the lawsuits, the compensation payments, the total destabilization. In 1946, the Tripartite Gold Commission was created, formed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. The official objective was to recover stolen gold and return it to its countries of origin. But what really happened was a cover-up operation. The commission established that only gold that could be provably identified would be returned. But how do you prove the origin of a melted and restamped gold bar? Impossible. Result of 600 stolen tons, only 60 were returned. The rest simply entered the global financial system as non-monetary gold. The neutral countries that had negotiated with the Nazis, Switzerland, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, made discreet agreements with the Allies. They returned symbolic quantities of gold and in exchange weren't prosecuted. It was a pact of silence. Everyone knew, no one spoke. And why was this silence maintained? Because the same banks that had laundered Nazi gold were now essential for Europe's reconstruction. The Swiss National Bank, for example, provided credit for the first Marshall Plan projects. British banks financed the industrial reconstruction of West Germany. It was impossible to punish them without destabilizing the entire economic recovery. But who really profited from this gold? It wasn't governments. It was private financial institutions, banks that intermediated the purchase and sale of this gold. Investment funds that bought bars with unclear origins at discounted prices and then resold them in the official market. Switzerland, for example, emerged from the war as the world's most powerful financial center, not because it had produced wealth, but because it had stored stolen wealth. Swiss banks offered something no one else could offer: absolute secrecy, numbered accounts, no questions asked. Nazi gold became investment capital, debt securities, reconstruction loans, and the United States, officially, they condemned Nazi gold. In practice, they needed it. Because Europe's reconstruction couldn't depend solely on American money, European capital was also necessary, and that capital was contaminated, but pretending it wasn't was more convenient than facing the truth. In 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended, the World Jewish Congress presented a devastating report. Banking documents proved that the Swiss National Bank had received gold directly from concentration camps, gold from Auschwitz, gold from Treblinka. Gold torn from bodies. International pressure was enormous. Switzerland was forced to open its secret archives, and what was revealed shocked the world. Swiss banks still held millions of dollars in dormant accounts of Holocaust victims. Entire families had been exterminated, their assets stolen, and the banks, they had been profiting from interest for decades, but the scandal didn't stop in Switzerland. Declassified British documents in 1997 showed that the Bank of England had actively collaborated in laundering Nazi gold. Bars with known origins from looting were accepted without question. The argument: it was necessary for financial stability. And Germany. In 2001, the German government created a compensation fund of 4.5 billion euros for victims of Nazi slave labor. But where did that money come from? From German companies that had profited during the war. Companies that continued operating, wealthy, powerful. Companies that had used stolen gold to grow. Here's the truth no one wants to admit: Nazi gold wasn't just a war crime. It was the foundation of the post-war financial system. Europe's reconstruction wouldn't have been possible at the speed it happened without this illicit capital. It lubricated the system, provided liquidity, allowed banks to lend, governments to invest, industries to be reborn, and everyone knew. Politicians, bankers, diplomats, but silence was the choice. Because the alternative was to admit that the global economic order had been built on plunder and genocide. And that was unacceptable. The Marshall Plan injected $13 billion into Europe between 1948 and 1952. But it's estimated that another 8 to 10 billion circulated through informal channels: untraced gold, private investments, bank credit of dubious origin. Without this parallel capital, recovery would have taken decades, not years. What sustains the global financial system isn't gold. It isn't money, it's trust. Trust that contracts will be honored, trust that banks are legitimate, trust that the official history is correct. But that trust is fragile, and when it's shaken, the system trembles. That's why Western governments protected Swiss banks for 50 years. That's why secret agreements were made. That's why documents were classified and kept hidden for decades. Because if the truth came out, the questions would be inevitable: how much of our current system was built on crimes? How many modern fortunes have their origins in blood? How many respectable institutions are in reality accomplices? And the answer frightens, because it's not an exception, it's the rule. The history of modern capitalism is filled with examples where initial capital came from slavery, colonization, war, theft. Nazi gold is just one chapter. But it's the chapter that proves the system is capable of absorbing any crime as long as it's profitable. While millions of Holocaust survivors died in poverty, banks profited from their gold. While devastated countries struggled to rebuild, financial institutions accumulated fortunes managing stolen capital. The wealth transfer wasn't accidental, it was structural. Banks didn't just store the gold, they multiplied it, invested, lent, charged interest. Transformed stolen metal into financial empires. And when they were finally confronted in the 1990s, they paid compensation that represented less than 5% of what they had profited. That's the pattern. Crises create opportunities for those with capital. And it doesn't matter where that capital came from. The system doesn't ask. The system absorbs. And those who control the system prosper, while those who were robbed disappear from history. Nazi gold didn't just finance bridges and factories. It financed an illusion. The illusion that the global economic order has moral foundations, that money is neutral, that the past can be forgotten if it's convenient. But the truth is darker. The modern financial system was built on the same logic that allowed the Holocaust. The logic that some lives are worth less, that some crimes are acceptable, that profit justifies silence. And as long as this logic persists, history will repeat itself. New plunders, new launderings, new silences. If this gave you a new perspective on how power and money really work, subscribe. History has the answers. It'll show you where to look.